December 17th, 1944, 0530 hours. Hansfeld, Belgium. The Tiger tank's engine coughed, sputtered, and died. SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper slammed his fist against the metal hatch. The sound echoed through the icy pre-dawn air. Around him, the snow-covered fields were filled with silent giants, Tiger tanks, half-tracks, armored vehicles, all still, all lifeless. His driver's trembling voice came through the radio. Herr Obersturmbannführer, the reserve tank is dry, completely empty. Peiper climbed down his boots, crunching on the frozen soil. In the dim gray light, he could see them the greatest armored spearhead Germany had ever assembled for Operation Watch on the Rhine, now paralyzed. 67 tanks. Nearly 5,000 elite Waffen SS soldiers. All stopped by a single, invisible enemy, the lack of fuel. And just beyond the fog lay Hansfeld, a small Belgian village abandoned by the Americans. Fires still burned in barrels. Coffee cups still steamed on tables. And there, lined up like a gift from the gods of war, stood rows upon rows of olive-drab jerry cans, thousands of them. American fuel. Peiper approached in silence, his breath hanging in the air. He opened one can. The sharp scent of high-octane gasoline filled the air. A soldier shouted, "Gasoline, Herr Peiper, American fuel." The men erupted into motion, rushing to refuel their tanks. The numbers were staggering, 5,000 gallons of pure American fuel. Enough to move his entire Kampfgruppe toward the Meuse River? Maybe enough to change the war? Peiper allowed himself a rare smile. Perhaps against all odds, the gods of war were on Germany's side that morning. But he was wrong. Very wrong. Because that miracle would soon reveal a terrible truth that the war was already lost and Germany just hadn't realized it yet. The morning mist curled around the steel monsters as Peiper's men worked frantically. The air reeked of gasoline and hope. Each jerry can they emptied felt like stolen time, like borrowed strength from an empire that never seemed to run dry. Peiper walked among the rows of fuel cans, counting silently. 50,000 gallons, a treasure that could mean the difference between triumph and annihilation. To his men, it was a miracle. To Peiper, it was a question. How could the Americans abandon so much? He opened one of the depot's ledgers found in a small office. Sergeant Wilhelm Hoffman, who spoke English, translated aloud. The documents told an almost unbelievable story. The fuel had come from Texas, shipped to New York, then across the Atlantic to Liverpool, through Normandy, and finally trucked more than 400 miles to Hansfeld, all in less than 6 weeks. Peiper stared at the papers, silent. A pipeline of power that stretched across oceans. Nearby, Private Ernst Kara found a stack of Stars and Stripes newspapers dated just 2 days earlier. The headline celebrated the opening of a new fuel pipeline from Cherbourg to Verdun capable of delivering 3,000,000 gallons per day. A single pipeline could send more fuel daily than Peiper's entire armored column would use in its campaign. And in that frozen depot surrounded by stolen abundance, a terrible realization crept into his mind. If the Americans could afford to leave this much behind, if they could burn what Germany would kill to capture, then this war was already over. Peiper didn't say a word. He simply stared into the mist, the joy on his face fading into quiet dread. Germany hadn't just miscalculated. It had misunderstood the very nature of its enemy. Months before that bitter December morning, the seeds of defeat had already been sown. Back in June 1944, Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments, had presented a report that should have ended all German offensives immediately. The numbers were devastating. Allied bombers had reduced Germany's synthetic fuel production, the very lifeblood of its war machine, to a trickle. Refineries that once produced 175,000 tons of fuel per month were now struggling to make 5,000. Hydrogenation plants in Politz, Bolin, and Brooks were running at less than 10% capacity. By contrast, the United States was a world drowning in oil. In 1944 alone, America produced 1.8 billion barrels of crude. Germany, including every drop of synthetic and stolen Romanian oil, managed only 33 million, barely 2% of America's total. The Third Reich was fighting a mechanized war with horse-drawn logistics, while the Americans were flooding Europe with endless streams of petroleum and steel. Major Friedrich Seemann, a German logistics officer, had warned that the Ardennes offensive would need 4.5 million gallons of fuel just to reach Antwerp. Hitler had allocated 5 million, but only half of that ever arrived. And so, in a desperate gamble, the German high command had staked everything on capturing enemy supplies. It wasn't a strategy born of strength. It was an admission of collapse. Meanwhile, the Americans built a logistics network that bordered on the miraculous. The Red Ball Express, 6000 trucks roaring day and night, hauling 12500 tons of fuel and ammunition every 24 hours. Operation Pluto pipelines laid beneath the English Channel, pumping over 1 million gallons of fuel daily straight into France. While German soldiers counted liters, American convoys burned oceans. When Peiper's tanks rolled out on December 16, 1944, his unit had enough fuel for 50 miles. The Meuse River lay 65 miles away. Failure was built into the plan from the start. Yet Peiper pressed forward, driven by orders, pride, and the faint hope that luck would favor the bold. By dawn on December 17th, he had his miracle 5,000 gallons of American gasoline. But it wasn't salvation. It was revelation. Fuel, it wasn't just energy. It was the heartbeat of modern warfare. Peiper knew this better than most. At only 29, he was already one of the youngest Waffen-SS regimental commanders, a veteran of the Eastern Front, and a holder of the Knight's Cross with oak leaves and swords. He had learned in the frozen waste of Russia that fuel was more precious than blood. His Kampfgruppe was chosen as the Schwerpunkt, the spearhead of the entire Ardennes offensive. But even at the final briefing, General Sepp Dietrich's words were clear. You will have enough fuel to reach the Meuse if you capture American supplies. Peiper's allocation was 3,100 gallons, barely enough for 50 miles of combat. The Meuse was 65 miles away. From the start, mathematics had already written his fate. His orders were strict. Tanks were to move in single file to conserve fuel. Engines must be shut down if idle for more than 5 minutes. Capturing American depots was priority number one above even tactical victory. That same morning, just 20 miles away, an American officer wrote casually in his unit's logbook. Fuel resupply received 8,000 gallons. Third delivery this week. Storage tanks full. The contrast was staggering. As Peiper's column rolled into motion, the world itself seemed to resist him. The highways on German maps turned out to be narrow, icy farm roads. Massive tigers and panthers churned mud and snow, burning through precious reserves. Then, at a small Belgian village named Lanzerath, a platoon of just 18 American soldiers held up Peiper's entire armored column, 67 tanks, 5,000 men, for nearly 10 hours. By the time he finally reached Hansfeld, Peiper had already used 40% of his fuel. And yet, against all logic, he had found salvation, their mountains of American jerry cans gleaming in the pale morning light. Enough to move again. Enough perhaps to believe in the impossible one more time. He ordered his men forward. The engines roared to life once more, fueled by American abundance. And the march toward the Meuse continued deeper into the heart of Belgium, and deeper into the realization of a truth that no German wanted to face. As Peiper's tanks rumbled westward, their steel bellies filled with captured American fuel, the full scale of his enemy's power began to unfold before him. At every crossroads, every village, every stretch of road, they discovered something shocking: more American fuel depots. Maps captured from fleeing troops revealed a pattern that chilled Peiper to the bone. The Americans hadn't built isolated supply points. They had built an entire ocean of logistics. The U.S. First Army alone held 3.5 million gallons of gasoline in reserve. The Red Ball Express moved 2,000 tons of supplies every day, more than Germany could move in a month. For every Tiger tank struggling across the Ardennes, the Americans had 100 Sherman tanks all topped off and waiting. For every gallon the Germans guarded like gold, the Americans burned 10 just to heat coffee. When Peiper's men seized the depot at Bullingen, they captured not only fuel, but also American maps, rations, and even Christmas decorations. The abundance was unreal, a glimpse into an empire that seemed to run on endless motion. And then came the fire. At Stavelot, American engineers under Captain John Brewster received word that Peiper was approaching. Their orders were simple: deny the enemy fuel at all cost. 2 million gallons of gasoline sat stacked in jerry cans stretching across 15 acres of land. The engineers soaked the ground with gasoline armed with white phosphorus grenades. At 1630, Brewster gave the order. A single explosion turned the sky into a wall of fire. Flames shot 100 feet into the air. The inferno consumed 2.1 million gallons in minutes. When Peiper's lead tanks arrived, all that remained was a roaring sea of black smoke. Sergeant Wilhelm Vober, Peiper's driver, recalled years later. He stood on his turret watching the fire. After a long silence, he said, "They can afford to burn 2 million gallons? To deny them to us? What are we doing here?" Across the Ardennes, similar scenes unfolded, Americans burning millions of gallons rather than letting Germany touch a drop. At Spa, 2.5 million gallons destroyed. At Trauponts, another million gone. More fuel burned in denial than Germany had allocated for the entire offensive. That day, Peiper and his men realized they were not fighting soldiers. They were fighting a machine of infinite supply, an enemy so vast it could burn what Germany would die to capture. The inferno at Stavelot burned for 3 days straight. Black smoke curled high into the sky, visible for miles, an unending pillar of flame that marked the moment Germany's last great offensive began to die. Peiper's men stood helpless as they watched millions of gallons vanish in a sea of fire. It wasn't just fuel that burned, it was hope. Everywhere they turned, the Americans destroyed their own supplies before the Germans could reach them. The landscape of Belgium was now littered with burning depots, exploding drums, and the thunder of detonations that echoed across the frozen fields. The message was unmistakable: America had so much it could afford to waste abundance. Meanwhile, Peiper's tanks were bleeding their last drops of fuel. A Tiger consumed 2.5 gallons per mile, a Panther 1.5. In the thick forests and muddy roads of the Ardennes, that number climbed even higher. German maintenance officers kept desperate records. By noon on December 18th, they had burned through 6,700 gallons since the offensive began, capturing only 5,500. They were already operating at a loss. The Americans knew it. Through intercepted radio messages, Allied commanders realized the Germans were starving for fuel. Orders went out: destroy every stockpile threatened by capture. That same day, American aircraft flew 316 supply missions to Bastogne, delivering 16,000 gallons of fuel by air. They were flying more fuel to one surrounded town than Peiper's entire armored column possessed. On December 19th, the German advance stalled near Staumont. The tanks could move no further. Some crews tried siphoning gasoline from wrecks. Others simply abandoned their machines on the roadside engines, silent, frozen in place. By nightfall, Peiper gathered his officers. They had perhaps 8,000 gallons, left enough for one more battle, or one last retreat, but not both. And all the while, in Allied command posts, fuel requests were being approved without hesitation. Brigadier General Morris Gilland asked for 245 million gallons for the coming month. The answer came back: approved. For Germany, each liter was life and death. For America, millions of gallons were just another line on a requisition form. By December 20th, Peiper's offensive was collapsing, not from battle, but from exhaustion. His tanks, once symbols of unstoppable, might now sat lifeless in the snow. A radio message came through that morning: fuel convoy destroyed by Allied aircraft. No resupply possible. Continue with available resources. Peiper gathered his remaining officers inside a ruined farmhouse. Their faces were gaunt, their uniforms caked with frost and smoke. Sturmbannführer Werner Pütke spoke first, his tone grim. "We have fuel for perhaps 20 kilometers. The Meuse is 30 away." Silence filled the room. Then Peiper said quietly, Gentlemen, we are fighting an enemy who burns more fuel to deny it to us than we received for this entire operation. The realization spread like cold through every man in the room. The miracle at Hansfeld, once seen as divine fortune, now revealed itself as a cruel lesson. They weren't winning anything, they were witnessing the scale of their enemy's power. Across the Ardennes, American fuel records told the same story from the other side. December 16th, 3.7 million gallons in reserve. December 17th, 2.2 million destroyed to prevent capture. December 18th, 1.8 million received. December 24th, 4.1 million in reserve. For the Americans, millions of gallons came and went without consequence. For Peiper, a few thousand meant the difference between movement and death. By December 21st, his forces were surrounded at L'Église. They had perhaps 1,000 gallons left, barely enough to move a handful of tanks. The rest stood frozen monuments to futility. Private First Class Richard McKinney of the U.S. 30th Infantry Division later wrote in a letter home, "We've got Germans surrounded who ran out of gas. Our captain says we use more fuel heating coffee than they have for tanks." The American war machine rolled forward without pause. Patton's Third Army pivoted north in just 3 days, a maneuver that would have been impossible by German standards, requiring 3,500 gallons of fuel, simply for redeployment. The skies cleared on December 23rd. Over 2,000 Allied aircraft took flight that day, each burning more fuel in an hour than a German division used in a day. For Germany, the battle was already over. For Peiper, it was only now sinking in. The true enemy was not on the battlefield, it was the mathematics of industrial war. When Peiper abandoned his tanks on the night of December 23, 1944, the Battle of the Bulge had revealed its final truth. Of the 119 armored vehicles that had begun his advance, barely 39 remained, all immobilized, silent monuments to Germany's collapse. As Peiper and a handful of survivors slipped into the frozen forests on foot, the full picture of Germany's defeat became clear across every front line. Field Marshal Walter Model, reviewing captured American records, read the numbers twice before muttering, "We are not fighting the same war." Even Hitler refused to accept it. When shown photos of burning depots at Stavelot, he dismissed them as Hollywood fabrications. But for the soldiers in the field, no propaganda could hide the truth. Letters from the front spoke volumes. Americans wash clothes in gasoline. They feed chocolate to dogs. They fire artillery for Christmas. Every act of casual waste shattered what remained of German morale. It wasn't the enemy's firepower that broke them, it was their abundance. While German divisions starved for fuel, American refineries back home were experimenting with what to do with their excess crude oil. The East Texas oil field alone produced more petroleum than all of German-occupied Europe combined. In 1944, the United States refined 1.8 billion barrels of oil while Germany scraped together 33 million. The Axis powers Germany, Japan, Italy combined produced less than 2% of American petroleum output. Factories across America worked around the clock. A new aircraft every 5 minutes. A new tank every 7 minutes. A new ship every day. This wasn't just war. It was industrial annihilation. General Heinz Guderian later wrote, "When Peiper captured 5,000 gallons, it meant everything to us, but nothing to the Americans." At that moment, the war was over. Germany had lost not because its soldiers lacked courage or skill, but because industrial power had become the new weapon of total war. And America wielded it like no nation ever had before. When the smoke cleared and the fires burned out, Hansfeld became more than a place, it became a symbol. A reminder of the moment Germany's might was outmatched not by tactics but by production. In the aftermath, Allied investigators cataloged what Peiper had left behind at L'Église, dozens of perfectly functional Tiger tanks, half-tracks, and artillery, all abandoned solely because there was no fuel. Major Robert Harrison's salvage report was almost mocking. Fuel required to recover vehicles 8,000 gallons. Source local reserve. Time required 4 hours. What had been impossible for the Germans, a few thousand gallons to save their best tanks, was nothing more than a line item for the Americans, drawn from reserves that exceeded the entire German offensive. Even German commanders began to speak of Hansfeld with awe and bitterness. Field Marshal von Manteuffel admitted, "When I learned the Americans had destroyed 8 million gallons, rather than risk our capturing it, I knew the offensive had failed before it began." For German soldiers, that truth was devastating. One captured officer told his interrogators, "Your soldiers throw away chocolate. My men haven't seen chocolate in 2 years. You burn millions of gallons. We measure by the liter. How can we fight such abundance?" They had discovered a terrible imbalance, that courage, discipline, even brilliance on the battlefield meant nothing in the face of logistical infinity. Every German soldier who saw the mountains of jerry cans at Hansfeld or the burning seas of Stavelot understood, perhaps for the first time, that Germany wasn't just losing a war. They were fighting against the impossible. Peiper himself later told a historian, "If we had run out of fuel sooner, we might have retreated with dignity." Instead, Hansfeld showed us the truth. The Americans had oceans while we had drops. And that was the true tragedy of the Ardennes. Germany didn't simply lose its last offensive. It lost its last illusion that courage could ever overcome capacity. 40 years after the battle, the village of L'Église became quiet once more. Snow covered the fields where once tanks had burned and where men had frozen beside empty fuel cans. At the small war museum there, a Tiger tank still stands, its massive frame rusting, its turret locked, its fuel gauge forever pointing to empty. It remains exactly where Peiper left it in December 1944. In 1984, veterans from both sides gathered there. Among them was Karl Wortmann, one of Peiper's surviving tank crewmen, and Roy Anderson, a former American staff sergeant from the 30th Infantry Division. They stood side by side staring at the silent giant. Anderson finally broke the silence. "We always wondered why you stopped. We thought it was tactical." Wortmann gave a tired smile, shaking his head. "We stopped because our tanks were empty. You burned millions to keep it from us. How could we fight that?" Anderson didn't answer. He simply looked down at the snow and said quietly, "We never knew you were that short. We had so much. We never thought about it." That simple exchange captured the essence of December 1944. Two soldiers who had fought on opposite sides now united by a truth larger than both of them. One army had measured by the gallon, the other by the millions. Operation Watch on the Rhine consumed 2.8 million gallons of fuel, while during the same period the Americans used 267 million. The ratio said everything the war had been decided not by courage but by capacity. Hansfeld, Stavelot, L'Église each became chapters in the same revelation. That modern war was not won by generals or heroes, but by factories, refineries, and the mathematics of industry. When visitors today stand before Peiper's Tiger, they often ask the same question: why did they abandon it? The guide always gives the same answer softly, almost reverently: no fuel. And in that silence between the steel and the snow lies the story of a world that learned that courage can win battles, but industry wins wars.